How long can Putin's war economy survive? That's the real question. Not how many tanks he builds or how many men he drafts, but whether the money can last. Because wars don't run on slogans, they run on resources, on cash, on oil tankers, shadow fleets, and secret pipelines. And right now, Russia's finances are under strain. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today we'll open the black box of Putin's war economy because inside it lies the answer to how long this war can truly continue. Here's our roadmap from start to finish. Checkpoint 1. Imperial habits. How Russia's economy was shaped by centuries of hierarchy and privilege. Checkpoint 2. The Soviet blueprint. Why early and late USSR economic systems still echo in today's Russia. Checkpoint 3. Putin's rent model. How loyalty is bought with oil and gas and why external income is the regime's lifeline. Checkpoint 4. The war economy. Sanctions, shadow fleets, and the refinery war. How the machine is breaking down. Checkpoint 5. The red lines. Oil, deficits, interest rates, and social unrest. The warning signals that tell us when collapse is near. Does Putin still have enough cash to keep this war going? Or are the cracks already too deep? Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see whether Russia's economy is a fortress or a bubble waiting to burst. Which path to take? For most of human history, people had no idea how economies worked. Many still don't. In Western Europe and America, thinkers wrote about money and wealth for centuries. But only by the late 18th century did they begin to realize the economy follows rules, patterns, forces bigger than any king or minister. And from that point, theories multiplied about capitalism regulation and how to build societies that could be both prosperous and stable. Russia never went through that stage. For the aristocracy at the top, wealth was not a system to understand. It was a divine gift. Power came from God, and God would take care of the nobles. What happened to the peasants? That was not their concern. Peasants weren't seen as people of value. They were expendable. So what passed for economic policy in Imperial Russia? Mostly new ways to squeeze the population. More taxes, more penalties, more bans, conveniently lifted if you paid a bribe. Under that mindset, genuine reform was impossible. No wonder the Bolsheviks' fierce accusation against the Tsarist regime was economic. Yes, capitalism in the 19th century was brutal everywhere, but in the West, societies began to soften its harshest edges with laws to protect workers and lift people out of misery. In Russia, the solution was simpler. Make everyone equally poor. For the Bolsheviks, capital was not just unfair, it was Satan himself. And here's where the real disaster began. Marx's economic theory turned into something like a religion. Revolutionaries treated the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin as sacred texts, untouchable and unquestionable. Economic policy under the Bolsheviks was imposed with the same fanatism as faith during Europe's religious wars. But why? Why cling to a broken system? Didn't the Soviet elite see that the theories weren't working? Of course, they saw it. But the problem wasn't logic. Soviet bureaucrats inherited the imperial habit of treating every command from above as divine will. History itself was supposed to prove the leadership right. To argue was dangerous, so orders were carried out when possible, faked on paper when impossible, and passed upward with a shrug. The bosses know best. This is why the Soviet economy, despite its vast natural wealth, was riddled with dysfunction. On the surface, there was abundance. Underneath, there was rot. From the outside, many Russian government decisions looked absurd, economically harmful from the very beginning. But once you step inside the system, the logic changes completely. In Russia, everything revolves around social status. If you climb high enough in the hierarchy, you are literally safe. The higher you rank, the lower the chance someone will strip you of your wealth or destroy everything you've built. Of course, there are moments when the top brass orders purges against high officials, but these waves are rare. And the lived experience of the privileged class tells them that most likely they will remain safe. But there is only one way to reach that safety. You must belong to the state nomenclatura, become part of the machinery, serve it and obey its rules. If you refuse, you lose your status instantly and slide to the very bottom of the social pyramid. That means no resources, no protection. Any petty official can rob you, ruin you, or throw you in jail. And even if you manage to crawl back out, the cost will be enormous. This is why intelligent, educated people working in the Russian economy don't resist when foolish orders come from above. They are not suicidal. Survival means compliance. But then comes the question, why do those at the top keep making such foolish decisions? Because their time and energy aren't spent on solving problems. They are spent on fighting each other for position, status, and influence. The belief that their power comes from God, or at least from some kind of historic destiny, helps them cope with anxiety. Problems will solve themselves somehow. And they know they won't be punished for incompetence, because their real value isn't results, it's loyalty. A loyal official with the right connections is worth gold. That's why Putin never persecutes his closest allies, even when they fail spectacularly. In this system, loyalty is currency, and loyalty always outweighs competence. Early USSR. To understand Putin's economy, we have to look at the Soviet base. In the USSR, there was no private property in the means of production. You could not own a factory, open a business, or own most kinds of productive assets. There was a short window in the 1920s when small-scale private craft and trade was allowed. But the core rule soon returned. Socialist property, state or collective, was the only legitimate form. This was written into the 1936 Constitution. The theory said the state would plan, build, and provide for all. But in truth, the USSR in its early years had weak industry and little to sell abroad except raw resources. That's why life for most people stayed poor. In the 1920s, while the West had a boom, Soviet cities were drab and hungry. In the 1930s, while the West suffered the Great Depression, the USSR showed big projects. The Moscow Metro opened in 1935. Huge power stations like Dnieprogas fed new factories. The army grew stronger. It all looked like a triumph of social ideology, at least if you ignore the price tag written in blood. That price was mass purchase, executions, and a society ruled by fear. Rationing formally eased Medicaid, yet shortages, queues, and make-do became a way of life. A piece of sugar could feel like a treat. Housing stayed tight. The vast majority of the families in the cities lived in one room of a communal apartment with shared kitchen and bathroom. For the peasantry, the system meant a return to serfdom in a new form. Without a passport, a collective farm worker could not move to the city. Travel required permission from the farm boss or the local council. Pay on the collective farm often came not as money but as work days, credits that later translated into grain or other goods. On paper, this system worked. In reality, managers hid poor results and called improvisation a plan. All this forged a social rule that survived long after Stalin. The only real protection came from a secure state job that granted access to goods and services. If you were inside the higher layers, the worst of the shortages and the fear were held at bay. If you were not, you stood in long lines to buy basic clothing and food, keeping your head down. The economy we see later is a direct product of this hierarchy. Late USSR. After World War II, the Soviet Union was broke. Millions of returning soldiers had seen Europe with their own eyes, its streets, its shops, its standard of living. Even half destroyed by war, it looked impressive. And it wasn't France or Italy, it was Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The thought was unavoidable. The revolution is long behind us, so where is our prosperity? Khrushchev tried to give an answer. His famous promise was to catch up and overtake America through consumer goods, mass housing, and big science. And yes, some progress followed. The space program became a point of national pride, and across Soviet cities rose endless rows of identical apartment blocks. Ugly, concrete buildings with windows like holes punched in a shoebox. What made it all possible? In the 1960s, the state opened massive oil and gas fields in western Siberia. First came Samatlor oil, then Urengoy gas. These new riches allowed Moscow to cover up economic decline and to claim that the modest prosperity which followed was proof of socialism's success, rather than the simple fact of selling natural resources abroad. Officially, the story was different. Citizens were told that Soviet oil and gas fueled the domestic economy and supplied the socialist brotherhood in Eastern Europe. The truth was never mentioned. The single biggest customer for Soviet energy was not Poland or Czechoslovakia. It was West Germany. Yes. Of all places, a capitalist country backed by Moscow's arch enemy, the United States. Back in the late 1940s, it received $1.4 billion from the US under the Marshall Plan. As the German economy grew, it needed reliable energy. In 1970, Bonn and Moscow signed the first big gas for pipes deal. German groups like Mannersmann and Thyssen supplied large diameter pipe, Ruhr gas to Soviet gas, and German banks provided credits. This was the opening move in a long energy relationship that later financed pipelines carrying Siberian gas to Western Europe. By 1984, gas began flowing through the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhgorod trunk line, built despite US objection. At the same time, the Soviet countryside was in trouble. Part of the peasantry had died in early decades. Many others moved to cities. By the 1960s, the USSR was buying grain abroad on a large scale, mainly from Canada and the United States. In 1972 came the Great Grain Robbery, when the Soviets quietly bought huge volumes of US wheat and corn at favorable terms, driving prices up worldwide. A decade later, the USSR had become the world's largest grain importer. Hard to believe, given that Russia was once called the breadbasket of Europe. Decades of socialism had led to this. The country could no longer feed itself without Western grain. Then oil prices jumped. The Iranian Revolution and strong global demand sent crude from roughly the low teens per barrel to the mid-$30 over 1 year. For the USSR, oil exports became a bounty of hard currency. That money paid for food imports and for the costly performance of being a superpower. One result was the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989. And here, an old rule applies. When autocrats get money, they spend it on wars, always. Victories, real or fabricated, are their proof of dominance. They need them to show their own cronies that they remain the top predators in the food chain. National finances are not seen as public wealth. They are a resource to elevate personal power and social status. In the mid-1980s, the ground shifted. Saudi policy and global supply changes led to a price collapse. By that time, oil and gas provided around half of Soviet hard currency export earnings. Then prices fell. Moscow's earnings fell too. With prices down, the government could no longer keep its promises. Yegor Gaidar later summed it up in one line. The Soviet story is about grain and oil. When both turned against the system, food dependence up, oil revenue down, the regime lost the money that kept its elite and social contracts stable. After the USSR collapse. After the USSR fell, people were finally allowed to become entrepreneurs and make money, but the industries were privatized by those with information, cash, and force. Former party youth leaders, security officers, and gangsters grabbed the biggest assets. For a short time, Russia debated which model to choose, whether to follow the example of the US, UK, France, Germany, or even Singapore's authoritarian modernization. But eventually, it went back to the old doctrine. The Tsar is to decide. Whatever the leader wants becomes sacred. If someone disagrees, he must be a foreign agent. Putin's economic strategy was not about general prosperity, it was about expanding and securing his personal power. To do that, he needed two things. Inside the country, nobody should feel safe to challenge him. Outside, no one should be able to squeeze him. At home, he showed he could jail or confiscate from anyone. The Yukos case made that clear. The country's largest private oil firm was hit with taxes and criminal charges, broken up, and its assets moved to state champions. Independent TV did not survive either. In early 2000s, Gazprom Media took over NTV after raids and board changes. In 2004, direct elections of governors were abolished and replaced with presidential nomination and regional confirmation. Later, elections returned in form, but with filters that let the center screen candidates. Taxes follow the same logic. The Federal Tax Service collects the big taxes, and the center sets the rule for how much regions keep and how much they get back. That gives Moscow the lever to reward loyalty and punish disobedience. When a private project grows on brains and hard work, people from the corridors of power often take over it and fold it into the system. Two examples are VKontakte's social media platform and the Yandex search engine. VKontakte's founder, Pavel Durov, quit under pressure in 2014 and left the country. Yandex was split in 2024. The Dutch parent sold its Russian assets to a local group in a $5.4 billion deal, while the international pieces rebranded. The rhetoric is patriotism and import substitution. In reality, we see capital flight and mass immigration. Putin's rent model. Such a system survives only as long as fresh money keeps pouring in, because it takes mountains of cash to plaster over stupid decisions and keep failure from showing through the cracks. For today's Russia, those incomes are derived from the sale of oil, gas, metal, and other raw materials. Soviet industry decayed and was never fully renewed. A broad, competitive private sector poses a threat to the regime. When people have real money of their own, they begin to want freedom. That's why government policy ensures that every truly successful private company either becomes dependent on the state or ends up in the hands of loyalists. Yes, efficiency suffers dramatically. But who cares? The main cash comes from resource rents anyway. And here lies the paradox. Resource rents are not just the Kremlin's lifeline, they are also its Achilles heel. Without them, the entire structure tilts. What did the Kremlin want? For the West to keep buying Russian raw materials and never ask where the money went. At home, those profits bought loyalty. Abroad, they bought freedom to maneuver. That's why Moscow spent years working to hook Europe on Russian gas. In 2021, Russian gas was about 45% of EU gas imports. 2 years later, that share fell to roughly 15%. The EU also cut its overall fossil fuel imports from Russia from about $16 billion a month in early 2022 to about $1 billion by late 2023. That landed a hard blow to Moscow. Putin's regime survives while it can pay its loyalists. War spending pushes up GDP on paper, but it also drives inflation, strains labor, and crowds out normal investment. Economists now describe the system as a wartime bubble. It will not burst on its own. It will shrink as export revenues fall, as enforcement tightens, and as Europe's demand does not return. In that world, the cost of paying for the pyramid rises each month. International sanctions against Russia hit 3 pressure points at once: supplies, payments, and shipping. Supplies are about parts and machines. Payments are about moving money across borders. Shipping is about getting oil out and goods in. After 2022, Western banks and insurers pulled back. Chinese state banks then tightened compliance as the US threatened secondary sanctions. Russian payments to China were getting stuck en masse, and big Russian companies had to route deals through middlemen. This year, Russian banks even set up a China track netting system to lower visibility. Some firms slid back to barter. At the Kazan Expo in August 2025, a Chinese supplier said they were swapping marine engines for Russian steel and aluminum. This is not a return to the 1990s, but the rhyme is hard to miss. One particularly evasive target is shipping. Oil still pays most of Putin's bills. Last year, oil and gas brought in around 30% of Russia's federal revenue. To keep sales going under sanctions, traders built a shadow fleet of older tankers with murky ownership. They switch flags, turn off tracking, and do ship-to-ship transfers. The G7 price cap tried to squeeze margins, but enforcement has been uneven. Discounts of Urals to Brent widened in late 2023, then narrowed again as Russia leaned on that grey fleet and non-Western services. In early 2025, Washington blacklisted a fleet that had moved roughly a fifth of Russia's seaborne oil. A Brookings analysis identified 343 shadow ships, most of which are now sanctioned by the EU, UK, or US. The growth of this fleet was slowed under pressure, but it still accounts for a large share of exports. Domestically, the Russian economy shifted onto war rails. Defense orders rose. Wages in war-related industries pulled labor from the rest of the economy. Inflation stayed high, and the central bank kept interest rates painful. Budget numbers tell the same story. In April, Russia lifted its 2025 deficit plan to 1.7% of GDP. By early August, The shortfall had already reached nearly 5 trillion rubles, well above the full-year target. To cover the gap, the state has been dipping into the National Wealth Fund, its supposed rainy day reserve, to patch holes and bankroll projects. The real strain, however, shows up at the regional level. Moscow and a few wealthy areas like Tatarstan manage well enough. But across much of provincial Russia, budgets are in crisis, gaping holes that cannot be filled without federal bailouts. The refinery war adds a new layer. Since last year, Ukraine has systematically hit Russian refineries and oil nodes. In 2025, Reuters estimated that around 10% of refining capacity was offline at points. In August, reports showed gasoline shortages and long lines in parts of the Far East and occupied regions. Moscow tried a petrol export ban to calm the market, but wholesale prices still spiked. Strains are now visible in the civilian industry. AvtoVAZ, Russia's largest car maker, says it might cut to a 4-day work week. Other plants signal similar moves. Steelmakers warn that high interest rates and weak demand are hitting profits and new investments. Agriculture struggles with a lack of labor, spare parts, livestock medicines, and even seeds that are mostly imported. It is not a collapse yet, but it is friction, growing month by month. Watching the cracks. So how can we tell whether the system might soon collapse? No one can predict the future with certainty, but we can track the fault lines. Watch the cash flows. Oil revenues come first. Then the monthly budget figures. Third, the price of money. The central bank keeps interest rates painfully high, fighting inflation born of war. Fourth, refineries and pumps. In a country as vast as Russia, fuel costs and availability are not just technical details, they are lifelines. And finally, watch the regions. Rising deficits in Moscow mean leaner transfers to the provinces or emergency bailouts that cannot last forever. When the war began, many of us hoped the civilized world would unite, hold the line, and push back the aggression. But that didn't happen for two reasons. First, fear of the atomic bomb. Second, Europe's dependence on Russia's resources. A Russian collapse would have threatened Europe's own industries. This was Putin's calculation from the start, and it nearly worked. If Russia's army had taken Ukraine quickly in 2022, the world might have shrugged, just as it shrugs today at China's abuses. Yes, it's ugly, leaders would say, but we still need cheap goods in our stores. The problem is that appeasing an aggressor never works. Not in the past, not now. You bargain as if he cares about his country's well-being, but he doesn't. His real audience is his inner circle. His goal is to prove he's the alpha male who can humiliate America and Europe and get away with it. In their eyes, that's not recklessness. It's strength. This inner circle truly believes Russia's resources are endless. They waste them without thought. Experts stay silent, unwilling to be the messenger who delivers bad news. That is why we can say with certainty, Russia's economy will keep sinking. If Ukraine doesn't collapse militarily for lack of money and men, then Moscow will lose this war simply because it runs out of resources. There is only one factor that could save Putin and his regime: a second Great Depression in the West. Not triggered by Russia, but by Western governments' own policies or a collapse in global trade. In that case, Europe and America would abandon their moral principles to save themselves. It has happened before. In Stalin's time, the USSR was openly hostile, openly declaring its dream of conquering the world. But it supplied cheap resources, and so the world looked away. That is the danger of forgetting history. It repeats in different costumes, which is why knowing history matters. It is not a hobby. It is a survival skill. Check out my historical novel, The Prince of the Soviets, to see how the very same scenario played out the last time history turned this way. If you've already read this book, please take a moment to leave a review on Amazon. Books like this can only reach a wide audience when thoughtful readers recommend them. Your words truly make a difference. If this video helped you see Russia's war economy more clearly, stay with the channel. Share it with someone who still wonders how long Moscow can keep funding this war. Subscribe if you are new, and leave a comment. I always read them, and your thoughts sharpen the discussion. If you'd like to see another side of me, visit my channel Elvira Bary, Forbidden Books. It's where my passion for storytelling makes central stage, through short films that are sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes frightening, but always unforgettable. If you'd like to support this work more deeply, you can join my think tank. Buy me a coffee, send a donation through PayPal, or give a super thanks right here on YouTube. Every contribution helps keep this channel independent and free to tell the story as it is. And in today's closing credits, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who supported me through PayPal. Your generosity makes this work possible.